so I'm going to be kind of flying blind a little bit. And there's a way
Yeah,
where you can do.
let me lock the door.
There's a way you can kind of do a split screen of the recording. Yeah, like this. Okay, so we are recording. My hair's a bit of a mess, but whatever. I can live with that. Okay. You want to zoom in just a little bit more, or kind of come a little bit just a little bit closer? That's perfect.
Hold on a second. Let me make one adjustment. Hold on. Let me come a little closer.
All right.
Hold on one more second. How's that?
That's perfect. Okay, so we are recording, and we will. So I'll do just a little bit of an intro, and we'll just get started. Okay. Okay, here we go. Welcome to the podcast. I am delighted to say that I'm joined by Dr. Jonathan Baktari. Dr. Baktari brings over 20 years of clinical, administrative, and entrepreneurial experience to lead the current E7 Health team and US drug test centers. Jonathan has been a triple board certified physician with specialities in internal medicine, pulmonary and critical care medicine. He's been the medical director of the Valley Health Systems, Anthem Blue Cross Blue Shield, Culinary Health Fund, and currently is the CEO of two healthcare companies, E7 Health and US Drug Test Centers. He's also served as the clinical faculty for several medical schools, including the University of Nevada and Touro University. Dr. Baktari, or if I may, Jonathan, good morning. How are you?
Good morning, Simon. Great. Thank you for asking. How are you?
I'm very good. Thank you very much for joining us today. So you obviously have a very impressive medical resume, but this is not a medical podcast, I'm afraid. But thankfully and gratefully, we're not taking you too much out of your comfort zone because, as well as obviously your glittering medical resume, you've also a very strong entrepreneurial background. Could you talk to me a little bit about your transition from the world of medical to the world of entrepreneurial?
Yeah, well, it's quite interesting because it didn't happen overnight. I think as I was doing clinical medicine, I was drawn into different opportunities within the healthcare field, like committees at the hospitals and so on, and it kind of grew from there. It seemed like one administrative opportunity sort of led to another and another and another. So it was a slow evolution, and then eventually, making the transition to full-time being administrative.
Okay, great stuff. So, and how did you start from in your own entrepreneurial career, your own entrepreneurial career?
Yeah, truthfully, I think it all started by we made an investment in a franchise company, and that kind of sort of taught me a little bit about the business side of it. And as I did more administrative stuff, it just became clear how to combine, what I already knew and gain new skills and sort of on the business and entrepreneurial side, and how to mesh that with the knowledge base I already had.
Okay, great stuff. And currently, how many people do E7 Health and the US Drug Test Center? How many people do they collectively employ approximately?
Yeah, collectively, I think we're getting close to 40 almost full-time employees, and we have a lot of other vendors that essentially we contract out with. So it's even more than that when you consider, technical people that and third parties that we use. So altogether, it's probably a team of, 60 to 70 total people.
Right. Okay, great stuff. Okay. So you've taken the journey from being a one person starting up a business through to running a team of sort of 60, 70 people. And perhaps earlier in your clinical background, you were managing even larger teams than that when you're working in hospitals. What would you say have been the primary challenges that you faced when it comes to hiring and developing people?
Yeah, it's an amazing journey because I think when you actually develop a business and you own it, you know, your mentality obviously is that you want to surround yourself with people that have the same level of interest, conviction, culture. But I don't think anyone prepares you for how to get there because, you know, we all know that it's very unusual for people to treat a job that they have as though they own the company. And the question is, you know, what can you do? What kind of strategies can you deploy to help people make that transition and make it win-win for them? Where, you know, if they sort of become owners, that they will reap the benefits of that mentality, and the company will grow better, faster, sooner.
Right. Okay. And have you personally sort of encountered any challenges in trying to achieve that?
Well, I think when you're first starting off, I think this is a challenge that almost nobody knows ahead of time, but it exists universally, which is when you're first starting out and you're a one-man show, let's say, and you hire your first two, three people. Obviously, the first two, three people you're going to hire are going to be key employees that would potentially be almost fatal if something, you know, if they were to stop working for you one day. So I think what happens is when people hire their first few employees, they're really not in a position to dictate culture in a really meaningful way because you can only dictate culture if where in a scenario where those initial employees uh, need need you more than you need them. And I think when you first start off, you're often put in a position where the employees feel like potentially they might feel, unless you get very lucky, that they will quickly realize that you need them more than they need you because they know there's only one employee, and if whatever reason, if it doesn't work out, you know, sometimes you're really left in the lurch. So if that becomes obvious to your first set of employees, it really doesn't put you in a position to sort of do teaching and coaching in a way that you would really want to do if you had a lot more redundancy in those positions. So that
So,
becomes very challenging.
okay, no, that's great. So how would you go about avoiding that? So if somebody is a a one man band or a mom and pop, and they need um, whether it's an operations director or a salesperson, whatever it is, someone that's going to take a significant chunk off their workload, so they can go ahead and start to grow the business. How would you how would you suggest that that person creates this situation where the employee doesn't feel that they're the one holding all the cards?
Well, one, you could get lucky and just, you know, hit the jackpot and hire the first person you hire will not take that approach. But short of that, I think what happens in reality, a lot of people live with it. In other words, they will just say, okay, and if they never grow past two or three, they're never in a position. So they just, whatever damage that causes, they're just willing to live with it. It's, it's often, you know, saying, you know what, if we lose the receptionist tomorrow, there'll be no one in the front to greet people that walk in. That thought can be very frightening. So even if the receptionist calls in sick and you know, every other day, or comes in 2 hours late, and you know, 3, 4 times a week, you're willing to live with that initially. So the question really is, you need to have a mindset on your first set of employees that, as painful as it will be for you to become the receptionist and do everything else, in your mind you have to be emotionally prepared to do that. And once you are, you can have a different type of, you know, respectful relationship where both of you are holding the cards, not one of you.
Right. Okay. And how did you manage to take whether it was E7 Health or elsewhere from just a very small number of employees, where perhaps you were doing an awful lot of of kind of the legwork, through to being able to withdraw yourself from from the business and create a culture where even though you're not necessarily there first, not necessarily there locking the door at the end of the day, you still know that there's a group of people that are performing in the way that you would want them to.
Well, I mean, the first thing you need to do is communicate to everybody that you hire that because you're a startup, you need owners. And in our world, there's only three types of staff you can hire. There are people who are literally clocking in and out, and once they leave work, they're done. There are people who literally feel like they're an owner, shortly after you hire them or whatever. And then there are people who often, at least if they feel that you need that, if you need them to care at that level, they sort of will pretend to care because they know what you're looking for. So really, to get to the level where you can give autonomy and give responsibilities to people, you need to identify people who are actually going to care about the business almost as much as if they were owners. And that also means parting ways with people who may be doing a good job but are not giving you that extra effort. And those are expectations you could set out at the beginning. Listen, we're not a company with has 1,000 employees where if the 1,000th employee is clocking in and out, it doesn't really matter. When there's only 3 of you or 4 of you, clocking in and out really shows up. Once you set those expectations out, you have to be prepared to have honest conversations with staff and say, listen, I know you're doing an okay job, but given where our organization is, we actually need more. Not necessarily more hours, but and I can give you some examples of how you can decipher who is clocking in and who's like an owner. And we can maybe talk about that. But you have to be emotionally prepared to part ways, at least in the beginning, if that's what you need for your company to grow. If you just have a job where people have to package those things and mail them out, that's not really, you don't need an owner for that. And a lot of people can do that. But if you need someone to be thinking ahead, anticipating, creating opportunities, you're not going to get that necessarily from someone clocking in and out.
Okay, so let's just develop that just for a moment then. First of all, let's just talk a little bit more about, in your experience and in your mind, where, for all the different types of positions you hire for across your businesses, which kind of roles you look for that kind of ownership mentality, okay? And then beyond that, how you find it when you're interviewing them, because you don't necessarily want to leave it to, well, we'll figure it out when they're hired and we'll see what their attitude is. How do you? So my first question is going to be, what kind of jobs or roles does that become a priority? And then how do
Yeah,
you find it at interview?
great question. First of all, when you're a startup, everybody needs to be an owner. So there are no filler positions. The vice president of my company started off, believe me, as an entry-level administrative assistant, as entry as you could get, and she's vice president of the company. I saw this thing where, the this was a few years back, but the CEO of Walmart China used to be a stock boy in Walmart. So I mean,
HP as well. Cara Fiorentino was the same thing at HP. She
right,
started out as an assistant and then
right,
moved
right.
into the boardroom.
So what we tell people, no matter whatever we're interviewing you for, we've got such a great company with so much opportunities that, believe it or not, we're looking for the same thing from you as we would if we were interviewing for senior leadership, because we're hoping you become senior leadership. If you're part of the reason why our company grows, we're going to figure out a way to get you into senior leadership, no matter what job you have now. So I think that's the mindset. No matter who you're interviewing for, I have to tell you, some of the most amazing breakthroughs we've had really have come from people that were, we were just asking to answer the phones, and they, walk into our office and say, listen, I've got a bunch of phone calls. Have we ever thought of catering to this business? And so it doesn't really matter. Now, if I have 1,000 employees, believe me, employee number 1,001, I don't want them to rock our world and give us great input and whatever. Because when you're at that level, you just need bodies to do the work. But when you're, 2, 3, up to 50, 100, 200, I don't know what that number cutoff is. You need everybody to be a rock star if you want to grow. So the way we interview is no matter what position you're in, we tell you that we want you to be super successful, and that I can't tell you how many times I tell people in an interview that the sky is the limit. So I think that is. Hold on, look, you're gonna have to take that out, and I don't know how to stop that.
It's okay. It'll go in the blooper reel.
Yeah, hold on. Give it another second. That never happens, but all right, that happens.
I think we're good.
Okay, so I can't tell you the number of times where I've told people. I mean, almost every interview, we say we really don't know, what you think, but we think that if you come on board, literally, and this is a direct quote, literally the sky is the limit, professionally and financially. Now there's really no amount of money you can potentially not make here, and there's no. I mean, you could become anything, but you have to be one of the reasons why we're growing. If the company, if our company grows by X percent, and we can say, if it wasn't for Susie, we wouldn't have had some of that growth, or Bill, then you're on the right track. And what happens is there's an analogy I like to give, which is if if the majority of people inside your organization are in it for keeps, they're owners. When you hire someone that isn't really an owner, what's interesting is, we don't have to point those people out. Other employees point them out, not necessarily even to us, but they realize that they're the odd person out. Simply, the flip side of it is, if I got a job in some sort of government agency or some other agency where everyone's just there to get their retirement after 20 years, no one's there to innovate, just pick on the post office or some other thing that's really innovate. A typical employee is not there to innovate or grow the post office. They're just there to do a good job, but that's it. That's because the majority of people in that organization have that mentality. So if I went to the post office and I got a job and I say, guys, have we ever thought about doing this, like, what, hold your horses, we're good. Versus us. So it's really once the owners outnumber the renters, or if you want to call them, the pressure turns on the people coming into the organization. Then you asked me, what do we do during the interview process?
Yeah.
That is probably the part that I still haven't mastered, and I'll tell you why. Because that is such an artificial process. I mean, it is.
How do you mean?
Well, I mean, it's sort of like going on your first date. You're not going to say, oh, by the way, I snore, and by the way, I don't have a good sense of humor, and whatever. So everyone's going to put their best foot forward. I think the whole dance is the person's trying to figure out, if they're smart, what the person asking the question wants to hear, and the person doing the interview obviously wants to put the company in the best light. So it's a very artificial situation. Not much information really gets transmitted. I think the things that I say are really helpful. I mean, for the most part, you can really only hurt yourself on an interview. If you start really focusing on what's in it for me, what time are the breaks, what time, when will I get my first raise, when can I start, all the sort of classic questions. I mean, you can hurt yourself on an interview, but we're assuming you don't. So if you don't hurt yourself on an interview, and I'll give you a perfect example. I would say the last 1,000 people I've interviewed, I've asked them if they're coachable. Just generally coachable. And coachable, by the way, is not like, not coachable. It's not like a light switch. There's different degrees of being coachable. So I don't expect them to. But having said that, Simon, out of the last 1,000 people I've asked, are you coachable?
Let me guess.
Yeah, take a guess.
I would say more than 999 of them have said yes.
Right. That's sort of asking someone, yeah. So they can't all be coachable. We know that because okay, right? It's sort of like going to call 10 of your best friends right now and say, do you have a good sense of humor? What are all 10 going to say?
It's
They're going to
funny.
say, oh,
Do you know, it's funny because one of my pet peeves in my headhunting business is when I receive a resume for a client, and in the kind of characteristics it says hardworking, and I'm thinking, why would somebody put hardworking on the resume? Because in the, I don't know, over my last 23 years, I've probably read over a million resumes, probably more. I don't think I've ever seen a resume that says, "Do you know what? I don't work that hard." So,
I have to tell you that that's exactly the analogy I use, because I'm not expecting to anyone say, I'm glad you brought that point up. I'm really not coachable. I mean, uh, or or when ask people, is this a career for you? Have we caught you in a period of your life where you're really looking for a career, or you're really just looking for a paycheck? Because there are jobs that are really great for picking a paycheck. Unfortunately, this job's not one of them. We need owners. And I've asked that question again 1,000 times. I've never had anyone turn to me and say, let me just be frank. Right now, where I am in my life, I just need a job and I just need a paycheck. Right? And I tell people, like, there have been times in my life where I just needed a job. I wasn't ready to give. So I don't think this is bad that you don't want to be an owner. And that's why I always phrase it, did we catch you at the right time? Because if you maybe if you caught me, let's say somewhere in my mid 20s and said to me, hey, do you need a job, or do you want a career? I might have said, look, I have these issues, and this is what's going on. I just right now, this for this year, if I could get a job, I'd be happy. And so there's nothing wrong with it. You just have to identify people who are in that stage. And then there are times you catch people who've been burnt out from three, four, five, six, kind of, it was just a job, and they're really ready to go to the next level. But you won't know that in the interview if you just say, are you ready for a career? Because when I asked that question, out of the last 1,000, all 1,000 of them were ready for a career, all 1,000 of them were coachable, and all 1,000 of them, this was the job that, they were really going to throw themselves into. So this is why the interview is really totally, totally artificial, where often they can hurt you. Now, having had 1,000 of these interviews, I can tell you what I would say to communicate that I'm sincere about that. But first, they'd have to pick up on the fact that this job, they're really requiring ownership.
so there are a number of schools of thought about the effectiveness or otherwise of interviewing, and there are some schools of thought that almost go down the road of, listen, at an interview, all you're trying to do is find out whether or not somebody is really, really toxic. And assuming they're not, throw them in, see what happens over the first 90 days. If it works, great. If not, okay, toss them out and go on to the next one. And it's something of a lottery pick. Um, are you steering towards that way of thinking, or is there a
No,
little bit more science to it?
right. So we've developed some strategies to address that. So, for example, and I think this really helps the applicant. What we do is we have now anybody who's applying for a position, before we agree to an interview, we send them a list of questions. And these are the kind of questions that if they answered wrong during the interview, would be a deal killer, right? So let's say you have a job that requires someone to do a lot of typing, right? So you don't want to be asking during the interview, how fast do you type? And then find out it's 10 words per minute, because you've just wasted their time and you've wasted your time. Or let's say there's a job that requires them to go between 3 offices occasionally. And you want to say, hey, do you have access to a vehicle? Just like if you were hiring a pizza delivery guy, and one of the requirements was for you to be able to bring your own vehicle.
Right.
So there are certain things that are deal killers. And I think the most common mistake I see made is people do not ask the deal killer questions up front and filter the interviews that way. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, but when we're talking about culture, how do you I would assume that that's not really something you can ask by questionnaire or by, or even in an interview. Going back to your kind of coachable or hardworking examples, right? So how do we, when we're talking about
Yeah,
building a culture for success?
but it's kind of indirectly is related to culture, and I'll tell you why.
Okay,
You have a limited amount of time. You have a limited number of interviews. You know, and you want to get to those culture questions. But what's the point of finding out someone has the perfect culture, but can only type 10 words per minute? It does go to culture because you want the interviews you do set up to be as meaningful as possible.
right.
And if you have 10 interviews scheduled for that day, and Simon, I remember the last time you did 10 interviews one day, it's draining from everybody involved, right? And if 8 of those were deal killers that you shouldn't have been interviewing to begin with,
Right.
okay, when you do get the one or two that are, you're just so drained, and you really don't have time to really, like, you found a real superstar and you really want to get a little deeper, and you're like, oh, I got another one scheduled. And so what I would say is it is related. You need to be interviewing only people that are qualified for what you need, so you can work on that other thing. So in a roundabout way, I'm going to make the argument that those deal killer questions are super important in you identifying people for culture, because that's much more subtle, and it's going to really require your, and I can talk about some of the strategic questions we ask in an interview once we feel we're onto somebody.
Okay, so let's assume that we've done the pre-qualification. The only people that are coming to you are people that have the hard skills necessary to be able to do the job. So they've got so let's just say it's a receptionist, just as an easy example, or maybe it's a salesperson, and this person has sales experience. They are, they carry a passport so they can travel internationally, and their track record is strong. They perform well against their quota or whatever it is. Okay, so even before they've met you, okay, they've filled in the questionnaire, you've seen their resume, and on paper, this guy or gal seems to seems to have what it takes. Okay,
Yeah.
how do we? So as you're coming into the interview, all the pre-qualifications done. How do you then use your hour with them or whatever to be able to determine that this person is going to add to rather than dilute the culture?
Really great question. So the first thing I like to do is sort of get the resume out of the way, because if I was interviewing, what I would do if I was them is spend most of the interview talking with stuff that's not on my resume, because I can see what's on your resume. So I like to get that out of the way, because I don't want to be sitting there and them, any question I ask, they're going to just refer to what I already know. So I kind of said, listen, I'm going to start off this interview, if you don't mind, and we're going to go over your work history. Go over the work history. So you worked there for 2 years. Why did you leave? You worked there for 3 years. Why did you leave? So I think the why did you leave question, we're just assuming they left voluntarily, really kind of is the first filter for things to come out, right? And I think a lot of why did you leave are very, very important, because that gives you a little insight. If someone says, well, I left because this other company offered me $1 more, well, then I finally tell them, I said, let me ask you. Well, I said to them, let me ask you a question. So let's say we gave you what your salary expectation are. How do we know in a month from now another company is not going to offer you $1 more, and you're going to leave us after all the training we've done? So these are what I called getting away from the standard thing. I think the dance that occurs is they feel when they walk into an interview that you have a certain predetermined question that they already think you're probably going to ask. They have an idea of what they're going to answer to those. So you almost have to ask questions that they would never dream of being asked. Once that happens, and both parties become more vulnerable, then we can really get to the core. And I So once I hear that, and then I explain to them, I said, like in that situation with the dollar, I said, to be very frank with you, we invest a lot of money in the first 3 months in training, or 6 months often. So obviously, if we lost you after 6 months for someone who paid you whatever, a dollar, whatever you want to say, it would be crushing for us and devastating. So I'm not just saying there's anything wrong with leaving for more money. I'm just saying from our perspective, can you see at least why that would potentially, be something that we wouldn't be looking forward to? So I explained to them, it's not that just that's the wrong answer. I explained why that might not work for us. And that kind of we basically show our vulnerabilities. And then often I find that helps them explain their vulnerabilities. And for it's basically going off script. The whole if you assume people have walked into this meeting with a predetermined script, both parties, how do we get you off the script? How do we get us off the script? Right? Where we say all our vulnerabilities, our issues, and get them sort of, if you want to use a poker term, on tilt. Where both parties are on tilt. It's not, you're not having that normal, we're such a great company, you should be lucky we're interviewing you, and I'm such a great, person, you're lucky you're interviewing us. We got to get away from that, because whether we fooled them into taking the job, it's not a win if 3 months later they leave. So you have to expose all your vulnerabilities of your company and your issues. It's sort of like spilling the beans about snoring on your first date, or whatever, and rolling the dice with that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Okay, okay. Right. I'm gonna. I've only got like a few minutes left on this, so we'll come off and then we'll come back on again. Okay, it's fine because and I'll just record it again and we'll knit it all together. So I'm gonna come off and I'll come back on. Okay.
Okay.
So jump back into the same Zoom. All right, and I'll let all this bit out. Okay.
Say again.
Just jump back into the same Zoom. Okay. Yeah.
The recording limit went off. Okay.
Yeah. So, but okay. You're doing great, by the way, so far. Absolutely brilliant.
Really? What do you like about it?
I'm loving it. I'd say let me come off and I'll before we start recording again. Okay.